So communism as counterculture becomes a very attractive option because it addresses these problems. Well, it claims to address the problems that are created by the new industrialized society that is doing a lot of damage to a lot of different people's lives. Hi, I'm Sam, and this is the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast. I got undergrad degrees in history, anthropology, and education because I love all things human and learning. But then I quit my master's degree and teaching program because traditional education didn't allow me to discuss the topics I wanted to and limited how I talked about others. I started this podcast to discuss culture and history without the limitations of authoritarian public schools and woke universities. If you also feel ostracized by the mainstream but love social studies, please join me here. Okay, this is episode 14 of the Illegitimate Scholar Podcast. The first thing I want to say is please join the Discord to discuss what we've got going on today. I would really like to hear people's thoughts. I have a few people sharing in there, but I really would like to hear from you, especially this guy from Belgium who listens to every single one of my episodes or has just downloaded them and they've just been sitting there. But hope that you, guy or girl from Belgium, is actually listening and that you are a dedicated fan. I appreciate that, and I would just love to hear your thoughts. So please join the Discord. Link is in the description. So this is another conversation with my brother Matt. He's a real estate agent. We discuss counterculture and how some countercultures become mainstream and others don't. We talk about the last few decades, especially for countercultures, with a few mentions of earlier ones and some talk about the countercultures of today, which I think is what's most interesting. So I ask you, when you're watching this, where do cultures and identities fit into the spectrum, both in the past and current? Like, how do you think about what makes a counterculture and what makes a mainstream culture? What countercultures can you recognize today? So what countercultures do you see in everything that's going on in the world today? Like, I would say that conservatives in a lot of places, especially like public schools or universities, are definitely counterculture. Even a centrist like me is counterculture, since they don't, believe in like neoliberalism and wokeness and a lot of things that I would consider, really bad and short-sighted and their own shortcomings. And this is the most important one, I think, and what does communism rising to power in some places and not others tell us about the culture of those places? We're not going to get too deep into that, but I think it's interesting. I think that invites thought even after this podcast. So join us today to hear about that type of stuff. Think about those questions and let me know in the Discord what you think before or after you've listened to the episode, or if you just want to yell at me. I'd love to be yelled at.
Yeah, so when you asked me to come on and think about a couple different topics to discuss, one of them that immediately jumps out in my mind is counterculture, because as fascinating as culture is, to me, the counterculture is equally fascinating, I think.
I think counterculture is still culture, right? It's just a specific type.
It's almost like a culture in and of itself to be different.
Yeah, I mean, counterculture defines itself on opposition, I guess, but it's
correct.
It's a culture that defines itself on opposition to the mainstream.
By being different in the mainstream, yeah. And I guess the reason why this was something I wanted to talk about was because in your previous episodes, you talked a lot about, cultures changing. And I started thinking, well, where does that come from? Where does that start? And this was the topic that came to mind. So,
yeah, counterculture. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the only way that culture can change.
True.
But it's one of the ways. I mean, it depends on how you define counterculture. Because the thing that first came to my mind was like, well, the Aztec culture changed a lot as a result of the conquistadors coming in and, fucking everybody up. But that's not a counterculture, is it?
No, and obviously historical sense, there's a lot to those societies that we'll never know.
Right.
We'll never know if there were little groups that created that change or created the spark that became the change or whatnot. I guess when I think about counterculture, a good example would be the hippies.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main one in America, yeah.
Yeah, you have the Vietnam War raging, and you have a small group of people who fiercely oppose it, and then they start to become their own culture.
And then they do a bunch of heroin.
Weed. Yeah.
A bunch of weed. It turned into, like, the 70s, it gets hairy with the hippies. A lot of them turned to...
But what's interesting is, what starts out as a counterculture suddenly becomes the norm. And then you counter that.
Exactly.
And that's where, the ebb and flow in society that you can often watch from year to year to year is super fascinating. It's something that is really interesting.
Yeah. So. I think it really is. And I think you're onto something when you say that the counterculture then, can become the main culture. It doesn't always, but like if something starts as a small counterculture and it's useful to people or it's appealing to people in some way, then they'll adopt it. Mm-hmm. They will. And they'll adopt aspects of it that they like. And certain aspects will become very popular.
Well, and I like how you said if it becomes useful to them.
Right.
And oftentimes something that's most useful to humans, even though some might not admit it, is being comfortable. And so sometimes there might be elements of society that people are not comfortable with, but then this counterculture develops where they feel comfortable. And so they set into that and they make that their home.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you say comfort comfort is like a light bulb to me, because like most of human history is like this long march of like making shit easier on you.
Yeah. And we're not innovators of that. Like it's ingrained in our DNA.
Yes.
Earlier in a prior episode, you talked about the path of least resistance. That in and of itself is a spiritual principle that's is old as time itself.
Right. I mean, that's a human nature thing.
Right.
Is exactly. That, the path of least resistance. If you want to, and I mean, that's why we have so many obese people today. It's because they can. And it's the path of least resistance to you have an abundance of food. For the last 150 years is the first time that a large amount of people have access to essentially like unlimited food. Like, people don't have access to unlimited food, but like for most of human history, starvation to death was a constant threat. Not daily, but like it was a constant threat of like, well, if there's 2 bad harvests in a row, we're all going to die. Like, and that was a common thing. That's not a thing anymore,
True.
In December, you get pineapples in the grocery store, which is wild.
We saw where they grow.
We did see where they grow. We were in Hawaii. We saw the pineapples.
Yeah. Well, but when you say obese, obviously that's a easy way to see it. Like people will say, "Oh, you're fat. You should just work out more." Well, the path of least resistance there is not to go to the gym.
Of course not. No.
The path of least resistance there is to eat more, which makes you what? Comfortable.
Right.
And so to bring it back to that counterculture piece of it, I think that people will gravitate sometimes towards different because it's more comfortable for them. And then they find a home there, and then all of a sudden that base gets a little bit bigger. All of a sudden you go from 6 listeners to 7 to 8 to 16.
I would love to have 16 listeners.
Right. You'll get there.
I've had 16 listeners.
I had 16, and then you lost half of them.
I did.
Clearly you're going backwards. But and then that's when that culture becomes a little bit more normal and a little bit bigger, and then that becomes the norm.
Yeah.
And then you develop a counter to that. So I don't know. I guess today we can talk about like a couple different examples of that we've seen, and some of the areas that we see it happening right now.
I'm going to talk about the biggest counterculture. You know what that is?
Maybe, but as one that pertains to you specifically, I will say the New England Patriots.
The New England Patriots?
Yeah.
Think I have a problem with them?
No, I do.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
You see where I just
I'm an
countered
Eagles
you.
fan.
Well, you're not helping my cause here.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a
But
New
you're
England
from
Patriots.
New England. Yeah.
I
right?
am from New England.
Okay, so then this is the counter to your dad, but a good small little example of counterculture is exactly just that. For the past 20 years, we saw the Patriots and Tom Brady become the most massive thing ever, and I had to hear about it from your dad all the time.
Yes.
But
that's the culture of Bill Belichick, baby.
That's and everybody loves a winner, so everybody jumps on that, and it becomes the norm. But then the counterculture piece of it is like, well, fuck Tom Brady, fuck the Patriots. We're gonna do our own thing. So you see what I'm saying there? Like, you either love them or you hate them, and the small majority that hate them become the counter piece of it.
Yeah, and that doesn't always develop into the main culture, but like, I don't know if that's culture though. To hate Tom Brady, I don't.
Yeah.
Is it
no.
culture? Is it?
Well, I mean, no, it's not a culture in general. But what I'm trying to say is like that's the mentality that I'm trying to project here. Yeah.
So what I was thinking of when I think of like the main counterculture, at least over the past 150 years, it's communism.
Oh, well, okay. Football, communism,
same thing. Yeah. So like, when I'm looking at the last 150 years of history, there's the main culture in all these places is like, it's like a legacy system. A lot of them are like mixed between like parliamentary systems and monarchies.
Free.
What?
Free societies.
Well,
mostly.
Not really.
Based on the thought of freedom, if you will, individuality.
A lot of the places that fall to communism, they have a long history of authoritarianism already. Like Russia, Soviet Union, that came from a monarchy straight to communism. You have China, which goes from a monarchy to a kind of a failed republic for a little bit, and then it turns into communism.
Understood, but most of the free societies that I'm talking about are ones that are like, we want you to live your life and we're going to help you to make it as good as possible. That's the theory, if you will. Communism, total other side. Yeah. We want you to have a good life because we're going to show you how to do it, or force you into doing it.
Yeah. I think that's part of it. Yeah. But when I'm looking at like communism becoming the counterculture, like communism as an economic and political system that is meant to address the changing situation when the Industrial Revolution happens. I mean, communism is a direct response to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changes the way that all these different countries, it changes the way that basically every country that industrializes how they deal with their workers. It changes the way like how people work. It flips everything on its head because certain things that people were doing before, they can't do them anymore. Mm-hmm. So communism as counterculture becomes a very attractive option because it addresses these problems. Well, it claims to address the problems that are created by the new industrialized society that is doing a lot of damage to a lot of different people's lives.
And why so?
Because there's all these changes that are negatively affecting a large portion of the population.
Right, but it was such a sudden thing, though, because with the Industrial Revolution, what you saw was a massive population spread out acres apart, and all of a sudden now you bring all of them into one city.
Because they
all
needed
under
work,
one roof.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, because they needed roof, but the best jobs could be found in this
right.
factory.
And it also destroyed the jobs in the rural areas because it shifted.
So New York City is a good example of somewhere that exploded in population, even had a big population, but even exploded in that revolution because everybody had to come to New York for that same reason, because I can make 3-4 times as much here. But then what happens is, you live on a farm with 20 bedrooms for 3 people to now you live in 1 bedroom with 20 people. And so now all of a sudden you have all these different problems that pop up. Gambling, fighting, excessive drinking, prostitution, theft, hunger, things like that aren't on the farm but are now in this big city.
Yeah. I mean, there's something just to be said. I could talk at length just about how city life is different from other places and how that might affect people.
True.
But like, as a counterculture, communism wants to address those problems. It wants to address those, gambling, drinking, all those things. Yes, absolutely. And also just like a lack of stability and a lack of a job and the way that that like capitalists, and when I say capitalists, I'm talking about like the people that control the capital, like a factory owner used to treat people. Like a lot of the labor laws we have today are the direct result of countries trying to appease the communists because they're scared of a communist revolution, which they should have been. So they changed the situation in all of these countries. Like, it even happened in America. Labor Day comes out of like, socialist and communist pushes for certain policies. But in places like Russia, they didn't change enough and it turned into revolution and the counterculture takes over. But in the counterculture in this case of communism, it's the most attractive option to people because there wasn't reform that happened. But then the original right wing, the original like, it's the monarchy, it's the white Russians like Romanov. But then when communism takes hold and then it becomes the culture over a few decades, that's no longer the counterculture. It's now just the culture.
The norm.
It's now the norm.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. But I see what you're saying. Like, oftentimes that counterculture is the direct result of somebody who wants to be different. or wants to be different, usually for altruistic reasons. You know, like, I want to change this because I see it being better this way. Like, everybody's doing it this way, but I think that we would be better off as a society if we did it this way.
Yeah, so I mean, that's Karl Marx himself. But I think what's more noteworthy is how those ideas become attractive to people based on how they're living. Correct. Like, the reason that that the ideas of communism appealed to people in China and people in Russia and other countries that became communist is because of the situation that they were living in and how bad that situation was. That they're like, well, this is a bad situation. We need to address this. All of us have this similar issue. Like, we have to address this problem. And like, I think that you can say the same thing about hippies and countercultures. It comes out of like the 1960s, where you have the Vietnam War, of course, and you have a lot of different things going on, shakeups in the culture with, you know, the civil rights movement, lots of things happening. And honestly, it's the beginning of like capitalism as we know it. You know, like the policies of capitalism that we have today are largely set in by Reagan in the 80s. And you have the precursor of those in the 60s and 70s.
Well, a lot of those people, too, will speak of oppression, not like in a racial sense, but in a our government's getting too big sense. The American government.
Who will?
The hippies.
Yeah, I wish that was still what those people thought. Yeah, I wish that, like, today, I wish that the people who fill the role of hippies still thought like that, because it feels like today they're very authoritarian. Like the people who would have been hippies 60 years ago are no longer like that. You know?
Yeah, well, and it's funny how that's going to be the theme of this entire podcast. It's what started out as a revolution and change became the norm, which then got revolted against.
Yeah.
Because going back to communism, like, how did, you know, what do most of those countries encounter are people who defy it and stand up against it and break off and do their own thing.
Right.
And then they become, you know, their own thing. But yeah, you know, the hippies, they saw excessive overreach by the government. They saw the war. It just created a perfect environment for them to get out there and do something about it. So it's a very visible example. But like you're saying, then also in human nature, you taste a little bit of power. What do you do with it? You run rampant with it, and you become your own, you know, overreaching authority.
Right.
So
right, and it's like there's also like individuals in all those situations. So in like the communist revolution, you have, and you know what? I'll even start with the French Revolution. The French Revolution, you have like in the 70s and 90s, it starts with like people in positions of power looking for reform, and there's a counter to like this old French monarchy system where the king is in charge and there's like a nobility, and the situation is no longer working for people and they want to change it. But what eventually happens is that once the not so radical people start to change things, the situation that then comes out is that the people who are more radical, they're now able to take control. And this happened in the Soviet Union as well, where Lenin, who was himself pretty radical, the Bolsheviks, which are like who became the leaders of the Soviet Union, they purged the Mensheviks, who were the more socialist, less extreme, and the Bolsheviks won out. And then Lenin is like anybody but Stalin. When he dies, he's like, look, anybody can lead us except for Stalin, not him. And then Stalin takes control because like that counterculture started in a certain way, and then it evolved over time to the point where it created a situation where somebody who is completely against, like, you know, there's not a lot of fans of Stalin. There's some extreme Marxist communists who do like Stalin, but it's very hard to defend him.
Historically, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, though, like, in that time, what was that like? I mean, did he have more followers then than care to admit it today?
He had enough that he was able to take control. And
right.
I'm not sure how relevant it was how the average person felt about Stalin versus how the upper echelons of the communist society thought about. Like, and their opinions were likely very different from the average person. But you have these people in these high positions of power who are now in a situation where, you know, somebody's going to take control of it. Like, the thing is running how it's going to, and no single person has any control over that. Now, like Lenin was the leader. Lenin's about to die, and he was like anybody but Stalin. And even him as the head Soviet, he didn't have the power once he was gone, once he had died, to stop that.
But then even at that time, Lenin being the norm, being the current standard, says, don't take Stalin. So what does the counter do? Well, we're going to take him.
Well, but it's like, yeah, I mean, that's what ends up happening. That's what ends up, I mean, at that point, they're not even the counterculture anymore. They've taken control of the government.
Right, which we've seen here recently, right?
What do you mean?
We saw 8 years of Obama, and then you have this extreme counter that comes along.
Yeah.
Trump. Well, not like he just comes along, because he's been around for a long time, but he comes along as a politician, as a complete counter to what we saw for the last 8 years, and it took hold. You know, just like you were saying with Stalin, like he had enough support in the beginning to get there, and then obviously over time that changes. I'm not speaking for or against it. I'm just saying.
Right. I think that's a great point. I would argue that Trump is not just a counter to Obama. I would say he is a counter to Obama, but I would say
it's
that
an element. Yeah.
He's also a counter to the 4 presidents before that. He's a counter to Reagan, H.W., Clinton, Bush, and then finally Obama. Like in the last episode, we talked about diversity, right? Mm-hmm. Obama is perfect for diversity because he is a black man. He's a half black man. His mom's white, his dad's black. Not African American because his dad is from Kenya. He's not descended from American slaves. And he is technically diversity. But he is a lawyer who went to Harvard or Yale. He went to Ivy League schools, became a lawyer, and has always been a member of the American upper class. And that is reflected. He was known for bringing in Ivy League people into the government, into his cabinet, and into his leadership positions, more so than other presidents. He's known for that. So in a lot of ways, he was this face of diversity that really didn't bring a lot of diversity.
I would say diverse too, in a sense that he brought more of the everyman.
Trump did.
No, Obama did.
Obama did?
Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah. Well, okay. Much like Bill Clinton did. You know, Bill Clinton was seen as more of a people's guy, people that you could relate to. And then you had the years of Bush where it was like, this guy's a robot.
They curate those.
Yeah.
They curate those.
And then, you know, people see Obama like betting on March Madness and stuff. And it's more like, this guy looks like me.
Right. Yeah. It's this cool, like, you know, if you're black, you see Obama, he looks like you. If he's just, you know, if he's like hanging out playing basketball, you know, that's attractive to even a guy like me. It's like, oh yeah, he's playing basketball. I like to play basketball. That's cool. But that appearance is like, it's curated by them. And so is Clinton. You know, Clinton's not even from Arkansas. He's from someplace else. Bush isn't from Texas. He's from Connecticut. It's like, but like.
And what's a good counter to Trump?
What's a good counter to Trump? I mean, back to Biden, right? Because like if you're looking at somebody who is a picture of the establishment, I mean, I would argue that Obama is a picture of the establishment. But Obama, only in actuality is he a picture of the establishment. On the face, he seems like a cool young black guy. He seems like a JFK figure, but he couldn't be anything less like JFK. He gets compared to JFK because of how he looks and his charisma. But really, he was he was a status quo guy. And he called himself.
He was relatable.
He was. But, you know, this was fake. He called himself like a moderate Republican is how he described himself. But Trump, you know, and yes, a lot of people believed this facade that Obama put out, and then those people then voted for Trump. Some of them voted for Trump. So Trump is, of course, he is the counterculture to mainstream elitist American culture. And people can think about that all they want, but that is what he was to a lot of people. Because he wasn't a mainstream politician. And people had been fucked over by mainstream politicians so long to the point that Barack Obama comes in. Yeah. And Barack Obama is supposed to be counter because he's black and young and cool. But really, he was just more of the same. And people felt swindled. And last thing before, say whatever you want. The votes that made Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, the margin in the states where it was relevant can be made up by individuals who voted for Obama in 2012 and then voted for Trump in 2016.
So changes. People who countered.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
People, yeah. And that developed, and that has all kinds of repercussions.
Well, and that makes sense. And, the whole point of this, though, right now is it's not a Trump thing. It's not an Obama thing. It's a human thing.
What is?
To go against the grain.
Right.
And so I like what you said, people being screwed over by politicians. Listen, it's been going on for 250 years plus, right? And it's going to keep going on for the next 250 years. Like, it's not going to change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we talk a lot about human nature versus culture. Politics are a part of human nature. How? I'm not exactly sure. We could have a whole episode on that.
Politics are culture, but the way that politics works, a lot of ways, is a manifestation of human.
But politics
human
as
nature.
a mentality is human nature. Like, if you go back to, you put humans in the wild, what would they look like?
At its most baseline, right?
You're going to have a leader, right?
Right.
You're leader of the pack or whatnot. So that's the politician piece of it. Like, how they go about it is going to vary from here to there. But
from culture to culture based on the needs,
part of human nature is going to be polarizing. Like, what do animals do? They stand up and they put their wings out and they do a funny dance. That's exactly what the politicians do.
Yeah.
Just on a different scale. But so that's always going to be there, and we're always just going to keep countering it. So that's from like the political piece of it. There's so many more examples that can be said. But what's really fascinating about that is it's evolving every single day, every corner of the country, every subset of people. Like, even within a culture that's very ingrained, you're going to have your counters, So being from Seattle, like, one big example that comes to mind for me of counterculture being from Seattle is like the grunge movement.
Yeah.
Came out when I was middle school into high school. More specifically, we'll say Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. Here you had a guy who was so beaten down and, self-proclaimed oppressed and miserable, and so he
was self-proclaimed oppressed.
Yeah.
A white guy from outskirts of Seattle.
Oh, Jesus, hold on. I could be so wrong on that.
That's okay.
So this
you're allowed
to
be wrong here.
No, I can't.
You can't be wrong about.
I don't want to go on record as being wrong. Like, I'm pretty sure he said he was oppressed, maybe just by his parents or whatever. But you'll have to fact check it.
I'll fact. You talk. I'll fact check.
Yeah. Okay. So one extreme example for me that stands out because I'm here in Seattle is Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. Here's a guy who was very depressed. Had a rough childhood, didn't really have a place in society. He was so completely different, or so he thought. And he found that music helped him with that, and so he created this band as kind of a counter to the culture, which was, at the time, MTV, commercializing everything. Music videos, people being arrogant, pompous, showy, especially. And at the time, those people felt like it was going against what music was, which was art. You know?
So come as you are.
Yeah. And so, he buries himself in writing music, almost like a rapper today would write about his neighborhood being a bad place to be. We see examples of that all the time. So he's writing about what he lived and put it into music. And for him, it was just a way of expressing himself, And somebody at some point decided to get him to put it on a tape, which took off. And then all of a sudden, his counter to the current culture becomes mainstream.
Yeah.
And it had a total opposite effect. Like, he didn't like that. Like, that was not what we were intending to happen.
And then he's on the radio, and he's part of what he didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
Damn.
And so then, he uses that platform to try to continue to speak, take that platform, continue that message, which is to say, how I feel about society and what I feel needs to change and whatnot. But ultimately, it was just too much, Things became too big. Next thing you know, like we see quite often across, anywhere in the world, people who have problems have a very limited number of solutions with the money that they have in terms of like how to fix that. And then what happens is you get a musician who makes millions and they develop a taste for heroin. It's all over. There's no stopping it, And most of the grunge bands that formed here in Seattle met their fate that way. You had Kurt Cobain killed himself, but he was a heroin addict towards the end. Lane Staley, Alice in Chains. You had Chris Cornell, same thing. So all these people who were musicians just as a counter ended up meeting their demise because it became too big. It became normal, and they didn't like that.
Well, I mean, but it also there's, a culture in music of drug use.
Yeah, true.
That's a thing.
Mm-hmm. Culture and money, you could say.
Right.
You get money, and that's what happens. But
yeah, it's because if you don't have that much money, you can't afford to spend enough on heroin to die, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so in the previous episode too, we talked a lot about the LGBTQ. That was not the norm for a while, like we talked about in the last episode. And so then a counter develops, and then it takes hold, and then it gets all over TikTok and all over Facebook and Instagram, and now it's the norm, And so I do think that counterculture, like a lot of people think of it as a bad thing, revolution, revolt, fuck the man type mentality and stuff. Right. But oftentimes, that's where tolerance comes from, and it shows people that it's okay to be open to something different than what you're being told to accept.
At the same time, a counterculture doesn't have to be that,
Doesn't have to be, no.
What a lot of people have been thinking about like I've seen this talked about a few times, is like a right-wing backlash to a lot of the left-wing stuff that we've seen in recent years.
True.
And that would be a counterculture, because the left-wing, at least social ideas, are definitely the mainstream right now.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody that's like a traditionalist, as you might call them, they're the counterculture right now.
Conservative? Yeah.
If you're on a college campus and you're a conservative, you are the counterculture.
Well, I'm in Seattle.
Right. Yeah. If you are a person in Seattle or New England, if you're a person on the West Coast or in southern New England and you're a conservative, you are the counterculture. Mm. You are.
Yeah. Maybe not and again, to be diverse about things, if you go to Texas and you're a liberal, it's the opposite.
Right.
So that little ecosystem requires all of those states to operate the way it does.
It's funny you say that, because like when I was in the Marine Corps, I was in a maintenance platoon of 50, it varies, but around 50 guys, and a few women. I was called on multiple occasions the liberal. Like I wouldn't even identify myself in that way. I was just what I would call a centrist, but I have a lot of left-wing ideas, and people would call me the liberal. I was the weird one because everyone else is conservative. There was a couple other like liberally minded people, but they weren't really into politics and stuff, so they didn't really have a lot to say. But I used to have conversations with 4 conservative dudes at the same time, all of them saying different things at me, and me going back and forth. And I honestly credit that a lot with me honing my abilities to discuss things. Is because I remember multiple times when I'd be like on the ship or bag of base, wherever, people are grilling me with questions, like smart guys, and I'm responding as the counterculture in where it was.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the things that we've discussed so far on this episode have been very micro. Counterculture at like its very lowest level, your closest to your daily life type level. I guess when I started with the hippies, part of the reason why I thought about them was more of the macro level, where it like
we talked about communism too. That's pretty macro.
True. Yeah. But it affected like every part of their existence.
Right.
Who they hung out with, what they did for holidays, what they did for fun, where did they work, like it generated a lot of direction in their life, and so we do see a lot of that here today too. Maybe not on that macro level.
In what way? Like where?
It's really hard to think of like the most prominent example for right now.
The most prominent example of counterculture?
On like the scale of like the hippies.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't think there is one.
Yeah.
On the scale of the hippies.
Yeah. Because
I don't know. Because I don't know. Like, we weren't around in the 60s, so we don't know what hippies were like back then. We only know what we've read.
I almost was.
What?
I almost was.
You almost were?
Not
old. Really. Born in what, 79, 78?
I guess, the number one thing that sticks out as being the biggest counterculture is TikTok. And if you were around from when it was still musically, to where it is now, like TikTok has never been mainstream. Like it's never been what's going on today. Okay, let me expand because that doesn't make any sense.
No, expand it. Yeah.
Everything about TikTok was always different.
Yeah.
You know, and it continues to be. Like it's a meeting place for counterculture, but what we see is then it becomes mainstream.
Right.
Because it's almost become as big to normal life.
Well, I mean, now TikTok is like the number one, right?
Yeah, and so now it doesn't have that same purpose. But
no.
For the first 10 years, you know, it was like that's where all of the most of the counter would come from.
Yeah, I don't know about a lot of that, but that's interesting. When I think about TikTok, like in the concept of culture, like earlier, I think it was on the last episode that we did, we were like talking about how a company will change in response to someone else. Like if there's a successful company doing something, then other companies are going to emulate that, or they're going to fail if it's something that's successful. And what you see with TikTok, I think what's really remarkable about TikTok is their innovative video format. And what you saw after TikTok became very popular is everybody copied it. Instagram Reels. There's Facebook. There's like short videos on Facebook. Not as much because Instagram is owned by Facebook Meta. You had YouTube Shorts. So all these short videos, like they were copied, and it did become the mainstream. It's interesting thinking about TikTok as a counterculture. I mean, it's a platform, right? So it's not like TikTok was the counterculture, but
and that's what I was trying to say though, is that platform was very much used in the beginning for being different.
And I would have said that Reddit was the same thing near the beginning.
That's true. Yeah,
you know, but now Reddit is one of the most popular places in the world, right? So it's and that's not really different. You know, going back even before the hippies, you had rock and roll revolution, which was the counter. You know? Right. And now it's so mainstream today that it's not any different. It's not in any way counter. But if you go back to like Elvis, Rolling Stones, you know, people like lost their mind over what they were saying. Right.
Like one thing that I'll never be able to understand in the time was the fact that a band couldn't say "in the Garden of Eden."
Wait, really?
Yeah.
No way.
You don't know this?
They weren't allowed to reference the Garden of Eden?
Have you ever heard the song "Inagata de Vida"?
Yeah, right.
In the Garden of Eden. But they were told they couldn't use those words on the radio. So that's why it's "Inagata de Vida." Because they still wanted to put that message out there, but they were told they couldn't. So they just changed the words.
Right. That's so weird.
But, and now go back to like the last TV show you watched. There were probably 30 things that were said that were way worse than that.
Oh yeah, 100%.
You know? So there's definitely an evolution of what's tolerable now too, and what becomes counter to what's tolerable today is beyond me and kind of scary. But
like
it all ebbs and flows.
Things are gonna be so different in 10 years. You go back to the 90s, you had like, you remember Ace Ventura? Remember those movies? You remember the end of like the second movie when there's like a transgender person? There's a transgender woman, like a male to female transgender person.
Yes.
And like, I was watching that scene recently. Like I watched this like a year ago, and I was watching it, and my fucking jaw dropped. Like I was offended, and it's pretty hard to offend me in a serious way. Yeah. But like I was offended by what was on this, and I was like, wow, this was a mainstream blockbuster movie from the 90s, and they were like dehumanizing a transgender person.
Right. And it's crazy because that same person, like I won't call out Jim Carrey specifically because I don't know if he would do this, but that very same person now today will sit there and speak out against it.
Right, right.
Know? But I had no problem making money off it in the past.
Right, right. You know? And it's just like, and that was 25 years ago.
But also too, for those people, they're experiencing this change just like we are. You know, so I know they might have thought like that. I'm not giving that specific one a pass, but like, what I'm thinking about is like some of the things that I might have thought were funny in my earlier days are not funny today.
Yeah, no, 100%.
You know, because things have shifted and ideas have changed, and we have been exposed to so much more. You know?
But I think that shows how completely ridiculous all of it is. Even though, when I see that scene, I'm like, I don't like that. I'm glad that that's not a mainstream thing anymore. But just the fact that it was able to change that quickly in 25 years, like what's shit going to be like in 15 years? And like when I think about things like that, I'm just thinking like, why are you guys so offended about shit? Like you're gonna be thinking a different thing,
right?
So
I'm trying to remember what I watched the other day, but before the movie even started, there was a disclaimer. Please note, certain things expressed in this movie were normal at the time. Can you believe that? I
mean, it surprises me, but I prefer that to them pulling the episode or something.
True.
Which you see in other things, but like, yeah, I mean, and in a certain way, like movies. Any sort of content it's a relic of its time, right? Like it's created at its time. So that's dumb that they had a disclaimer in there, but like what it points out to me is that like there's a lot of interesting things to learn just by like seeing what they put in a movie at a certain time and like what they thought.
Yeah, totally. No, and I like that they do preserve it because you were able to watch that and be shocked.
Yeah.
Now, if I told you what happened in that episode without you experiencing it, it wouldn't make sense to you. Like, I might not be able to explain it the way that you saw it. It might not have been a shock to you, like, oh my God, they made fun of a transgender person that way. You know, like you experienced it exactly how it happened, which was shocking to you.
Right.
But if I tell you about it and explain it, like, hey, back in the day, there was this movie that had this scene. And this is what they did. You're like, cool story, bro.
Right.
You know,
right,
but you experienced it and you can see, like, yeah, that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
But it's really cool that you can see it that way and see it as not acceptable, whereas the people who saw it in the time saw it as normal.
Right.
Like, it was just another line in that, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked about what's normal now in things like Saturday Night Live, you know, and what society thinks is normal funny right now, which is ridiculous, you know.
Well, listen. If you're listening to my podcast right now and you think that Saturday Night Live is currently funny, you can fuck right off. Because like I don't know why you think I'm appealing, but that's a me problem. Because if I'm appealing to the same audience as Saturday Night Live, then I'm doing something wrong, and I need to reevaluate my mission because that shit is not fucking funny. It's dumb as shit.
Well, most of the material that they have on there is run its course. It was funny for a minute, but they keep going back to it and back to it and back to it. And a lot of the stuff is about
Trump
society.
For 6 years.
Yeah, well, making fun of anyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you have an entire cast of people who are speaking out against talking shit, and all they do is talk shit. And
they don't want to punch down. That's what they'll say. Yeah. They don't want to punch down. They don't. Yeah. But what's implicit in that, and what this was in Dave Chappelle's recent special, is that if you're against punching down, and I'm a huge comedy fan, so I hear about this shit all the time.
I love comedy.
Yeah, I know you do.
I'm hilarious.
You are hilarious. Yeah, that's true. I'm pretty fucking funny myself. Maybe not as funny as you, but if you believe that making fun of somebody is punching down, then you think they're less than you.
Oh, true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's I hate that. I hate that. But on the show having the disclaimer, I wish that there was just an implicit understanding that content from the past is not going to match what we think today.
Right.
I wish that was just all the time. I wish. Well,
but to also use the word culture and how it pertains to recently is what cancel culture.
Yeah.
Anytime you give people a little taste of power, they run with it.
Yeah.
And if you give people the power to eliminate something, okay, I could be totally wrong on this, but it's like me saying, Sam, you're so wrong, and I got to flex my ego on how righteous I am by showing you how wrong you are.
Yeah.
And if I get you canceled, if 6 people have to stop listening to this podcast because I got you canceled, then it flexes my ego.
Right.
You know, and so then it becomes a conquest for a lot of people. Like, how much shit can I watch to catch somebody saying something wrong so I can get them canceled? Because it's almost like egoism on like its grandest scale. I'm so much better than you that I'm going to get you fucking run off the TV.
Yeah. And also at certain points, it's like if they're a competitor, if they're competing for the same positions, they're like, well, I get rid of that guy.
Well, that's just, smart business at that point.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess in closing, like, this was a pretty good episode to really make me think about a lot of different things. And I challenge anybody listening to do the same. Like, what parts of your life right now are part of the current culture or your current culture? You know, what parts of your life do you feel are different? Like what parts of your life do you feel like you're contributing to the counter aspect of it? And it doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be communism or being a hippie or whatever. But like, for example, like I'll say for me, I see people posting on Facebook every day, like, I just took a shit, you know? And then like 30 people like it. Like, that was a great shit. I just can't do that, you know? I can't go on Facebook and post every time I feel happy or sad or whatever. So it's very select. And, you know, for me, I developed a complex about that. Like, anytime I go to post something, I'm like, oh my God, am I going against my own culture now? Right. See what I'm saying? So it's very micro and it's very stupid. But at the same time, like, there's parts of everybody's life where they're fully entrenched in their current culture. And then there's parts of their life that they're branching off a little bit, you know? And where do you see yourself going with that? And like, why is that important to you? I guess like none of those questions are important other than just being thought provoking, you know, like,
well, what does important mean, really? It's like, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I hear you. What is important? But being in touch with yourself is important.
Yeah.
You know? Like, it contributes to your overall happiness, and, you know, it's a cool thing to think about, because it asks, like, what do I value? Yeah. What do I not value? It's good to know.
The standards for what we think are important is honestly really, really culturally defined. You know, the culture defines what people think is important, what people value. You know, if it's individual, it's not culture, but if it's shared with other people, what people value, then yeah, it's culture.
But yeah, I appreciate you having me on here. I've enjoyed these last couple episodes, and I hope to come back sometime.
Okay, that's episode 14. I hope you enjoyed the discussion on countercultures. As we're leaving here, I hope you'll think about what ways you're part of a counterculture and what ways you're part of the mainstream culture. And implicit in that is kind of an examination of that, of like, are you sure that what you believe in is the counterculture, or did it used to be a counterculture and has ascended to become the main culture, like the hippies that we discussed? You know, one way to tell is to ask, is what I'm thinking supported by mainstream large international corporations? And if the answer is yes, then I have bad news for you. That likely is the mainstream culture masquerading as a counterculture. I think it requires a little bit of more of an examination to figure out what really is counterculture. So I would love to hear anyone's thoughts on those questions or any other thoughts that you had on this episode. Please join me in the Discord. There is a little bit of a discussion going on from some of my very dedicated listeners who are also my friends, but I would welcome anybody. I would really love to hear random people's thoughts, especially because my friends are very biased and they lie to me. So please join the Discord. Let me know what you have to say. And, you know, at this point, I will respond to anybody that says anything. So if you want my personalized take on it, then please just go to the Discord, send me an email, send me a DM on social media, and I would love to hear from you. Those links will be in the podcast description on the link tree, and on the link tree from any one of my social medias, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, any of them. All right, thanks. Have a good rest of your day.